After the frankly terrible piece of work featured in the last episode, I wanted to watch something much more well crafted. Enter The Triplets of Belleville, a 2003 film by director, animator, and comic writer Sylvain Comet. I was first introduced to this film by my dear girlfriend a couple years back, and I really enjoyed it. So I've decided to give it a closer look for this channel. The Triplets of Belleville is the tale of an old woman named Madame Souza, who journeys to the far-off city of Belleville to rescue her grandson, Champion, from the clutches of the French Mafia. The film opens up on a performance by our titular triplets, presented like a rubber hose cartoon from the 1930s. Aside from being an amusing series of gags and a jaunty musical number, this scene is important in establishing what kind of world this story takes place in. When we get into the main part of the story, there are a number of very cartoony absurdities that come up to advance the plot. But because the world was established as this cartoony from the get-go, moments like this don't feel out of place. Rather, they come off as quirky and thoughtful. It's also interesting that the art style of the world changes based on what era it's in. On the topic of quirks, the humor is quite successful. It keeps the viewer on their toes, not letting them be sure of what's going to happen next. Oftentimes a situation will go in an unexpected direction, which sometimes makes for a better laugh than something predictable. Visually, this film is nothing short of beautiful. The animation is excellently done, maintaining a very smooth flow throughout, and the backgrounds are exquisitely detailed. Another thing to note is that the film uses 3D models for certain parts. They're rendered in the same art style as the 2D drawings and are lit to match the lighting of the scenes, allowing them to seamlessly blend in. For the most part, the film is well paced and keeps things engaging with humor, action, and sometimes surreal imagery. The first portion of the movie is a little on the slow side, as we watch the rather dull daily life of our main characters. However, unlike in Ratatouille, the monotony of this sequence seems to be by design. It serves as quite a contrast to the grand adventure Madame Souza embarks on to save Champion, and contributes to the overall message of the film, which I'll get to later. The cinematography is nothing to scoff at either. There are many types of shots and camera angles at use here, keeping the scenes feeling fresh and interesting without going overboard. Some of my personal favorite shots are these sweeping pans over Belleville, which really emphasize the sheer size of the city and often serve as good scene transitions. The film has very little spoken dialogue, so most of the story is told through action and the soundtrack, both of which are used very effectively. In the second part of my channel premiere, I touched a tiny bit on how expressions and body language can say just as much as the characters straight up explaining to us how they feel. However, this does lead to one of my only real criticisms of the film. Our protagonist, Madame Souza, tends to have this rather blank expression on her face most of the time. While her actions speak volumes about her character, at times it can be difficult to determine what she's feeling since her expression rarely changes. There are some scenes where her expression subtly changes, which really helps add to the mood. Speaking of mood, the film does a great job of generating atmosphere. The visuals and soundtrack go beautifully in tandem with each other. Even the absence of the soundtrack is used effectively, which when combined with the color and lighting creates a sense of either loneliness, peace, or even tension. Foreshadowing is another technique this film uses very well. Some of the details they use are a bit more overt, like the sign on the back of this bus reading "Danger." Pretty obvious, but it's also vague enough to leave the audience wondering what that danger could be. Then there's the subtler details like Madame Souza scrubbing down Champion like a racehorse, and their dog, Bruno, having a nightmare of speeding down a straight road into a wall. Even without spoken dialogue, the film succeeds in rounding out our main characters. Madame Souza is a resourceful, loving, and determined old woman, exhibited by her interactions with Champion and her admirable efforts to rescue him. Yet she's also a little unbalanced and out of tune with what seems to be her only family, seen with her previous struggles to connect with Champion and the obsessive training regimen she put him through for much of his life. Even though she didn't intend to, she ended up treating him more like a racehorse than a grandson, which is a crucial element to the story and important part of her character arc. Even though her pushing him so much led to his abduction, she goes out of her way to chase down the Mafia across the sea to get him back. Champion himself isn't as round a character as his grandmother, but has enough development to contribute to the story. He's a rather quiet boy with an interest in music, At first he wasn't very connected to Madame Souza at all, but then they bonded over him playing with the tricycle she got for him. When we see him grow up and train with her, he just seems to be going through the motions to make her happy. Sweet, but kind of sad. The only time we see any indication of him enjoying himself is when he starts listening to music. I would touch on the final outcome of their relationship, but I don't want to spoil the ending. Next we have Bruno, their fearful but loyal dog. He mostly serves as comic relief, but a few times throughout the film we have scenes of him dreaming, which either serve as interesting scene transitions or play an actual role in the plot. So what about the triplets? They are one fun bunch, a trio of musical, playful, and somewhat eccentric women. The way they're depicted during the main part of the story coincides with the rubber hose era they came from, meaning that like Madame Souza, they're resourceful in a cartoonish manner. For instance, one of the triplets goes out to catch frogs for her and her sisters to eat, and does so by blasting the frogs out of the creek with a grenade. Then we have our antagonists, the Mafia henchmen. These guys are nothing short of intimidating. They're tall, quite literally square-shouldered, heavily armed, and surprisingly elusive. Oftentimes they look like walking walls of shadow, something you would not want approaching you. These darkly clad men have a plan for their prey, and let me tell you, the film does not sugarcoat how cruel it is. Lastly, let's talk about the message of the film, which I believe says something about life and family. The motif of family is cleverly integrated into the story. Madame Souza stays with the triplets for quite some time during her search, and becomes like a sister to them. And since her son was abducted by the Mafia, it ends up being a battle between a true, loving family and a wicked crime family. One that values their kin, and another that shows no regard for human life. For that matter, Souza's journey teaches her that there's more to life than staying at home or blowing a whistle at her son all day. She and Champion lived in a house literally walled off from the rest of the world, and only stepped outside to bike the same loops around town. Meanwhile, Bruno would just sit around at home and wait out the clock until they came home to eat. Compare that to the lives of the triplets. They're stuck living in a tiny apartment in the sleazier side of Belleville, yet they remain as lively and spirited as they were in their prime. They make the most of their time together. It seems the main message of the film is to not take your family for granted, and that life is a precious thing that shouldn't be wasted. There's a much bigger world outside of one's own home, and while danger and wickedness may be lurking out there, there is still beauty and joy to be found in Belleville. The Triplets of Belleville is a wonderfully crafted work of animation and a fine example of storytelling. It sports appealing and smooth animation, excellent 3D integration, thoughtful and accessible symbolism, memorable characters, slick humor, and an enduring message. If you're looking for an interesting and kind of unusual animated film, give this one a shot. And that concludes this episode of Animate Ball. Thanks for watching! If you'd like to stay up to date with all things Animate Ball, click that little red button beneath the video that says subscribe. Feel free to discuss the animation in the comments, but please try to keep it civil. It makes the experience better for everyone. If you know of any interesting or more obscure animated works that you think would be worth discussing, don't hesitate to suggest any. Next time on Animate Ball.
He's the one who makes things go outside in the night.